All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to our Tuesday morning live stream Bible class here from Bethlehem Lutheran Church in Menominee Falls in Germantown, Wisconsin. It's a privilege to have you joining us this morning as we continue our study of the Book of Beginnings, the beginning of the Book of Beginnings, the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And we're going to be starting a new lesson today that was posted earlier this morning in the Facebook feed. Should still be at the top right below this video. A link to that lesson that covers Genesis chapters 8 and 9. So we're going to really be bringing the flood story to a close in this lesson. We kind of ominously left Noah on the ark with the earth flooded for 150 days, and now we're going to pick up with Noah actually, or the flood waters receding and Noah coming off the ark. So that's going to kind of be the plan for today as we'll march into lesson 6, which is the flood part 2, covering chapters 8 and 9. But before we talk about that lesson, let's begin the study with prayer. So we pray. Lord Jesus Christ, you are the one who reminds us that even in the midst of our suffering, you are able to bless, that even as we carry the crosses that you have placed in our life, we can trust in you to always give us the strength and the comfort that we need to carry that cross. We ask that as we study your word today and see the example of Noah, that you would create in us such confidence in your preservation and providence, that we might always be eager and ready to carry whatever cross you may, in your wisdom and mercy, choose to send into our lives. We ask this in all things in your holy name. Amen. Okay, so like I said, we're beginning the new lesson. So if you'd like to pull it up, if you'd like to follow along with the discussion guide, that should be printed for you below. But we're going to begin with this lesson by talking about anthropomorphisms and anthropopathisms. So an anthropomorphism is a very common figure of speech in which some kind of physical human form is ascribed to God. Now remember that God is spirit. God does not have a physical form. Sometimes he takes physical form for a short time, as he did, for example, with Abraham and before the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Or sometimes the Lord, takes the form of inanimate objects, like the pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. So the Lord can take forms to appear to his people. But generally speaking, technically speaking, strictly speaking, God is spirit. God does not have a form. And yet there are all kinds of anthropomorphisms in the Bible where some kind of human characteristic, physical human characteristic, is ascribed to God. So think about, for example, all the passages that talk about the eyes of God. The eyes of God are on the righteous. Or the eyes of God see all things. Well, God doesn't literally have eyes. So it's an anthropomorphism. It's ascribing to God the possession of physical human eyes as a way of helping us understand that God knows everything that's going on. So the fact that the eyes of God are on the righteous is the Bible's way of reminding us that God never takes his eyes off of us, that he is always he is always remembering us and watching over us. Or one of the most common anthropomorphisms in the Bible is God's right hand. In the Psalms, for example, very often the Lord will raise his right hand to rescue his people. So in the New Testament, Jesus ascends to the right hand of God. And of course, God, as true spirit, God doesn't have a right hand. But the hand of God becomes a symbol for his power. So to ascend to the right hand of God means that Jesus has ascended to a place of all power and might and majesty and strength. So anthropomorphism is where some kind of human characteristic, physical human characteristic like eyes or the mouth of the Lord has spoken, or the lips of the Lord have spoken, or God's hand, or God's, place everything under his feet. God doesn't necessarily have feet, doesn't strictly speaking have feet. Nevertheless, that is the kind of language that's used. Just remember that an anthropomorphism is where a physical human form or physical human characteristic is ascribed to God, and that's what we call an improper ascription, because God doesn't strictly speaking or properly speaking, God is spirit, so God doesn't have hands or eyes or feet or a mouth or things like that. Now, my guess is that for most people, for most Christians, that anthropomorphisms are easy to grasp. That we understand that God doesn't literally have a right hand, but how the right hand of God becomes a symbol for power in the Old Testament. Or God doesn't literally have eyes, but it's a way of talking about God's awareness of all things, or awareness of the strengths or the sufferings of his people. What's a little tougher for people, most Christians, to grasp is the idea of anthropopathism. And the reason that I started with anthropomorphism is because it's something that we're a little more familiar with. But anthropopathisms are a common scriptural figure of speech in which real human emotions are ascribed to God. Now, this is a little more complicated, because, of course, God does feel emotions. God has emotions that are similar to our emotions in some way or another, and it's actually the other way around. Because we are made in the image of God, we have emotions that are similar to God's emotions. But strictly speaking, God never changes. Strictly speaking, God is immutable, is the attribute of God. He's unchanging. He's the writer of the Hebrews says he's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Or even that great covenant name of God that he reveals to us as his people, I am the great I am. Tell them I am has sent you. This thing that God does not change. You can never say that God was or God will be. You can only say God is. He is the great I am. So just like anthropomorphisms can be used to improperly ascribe human physical forms to God to help us understand what's going on in the mind of heart and heart of God, so too human emotions can be improperly, and when I say improperly, I just mean in the sense that it isn't strictly true, can be improperly applied to God to help us understand what's going on in the heart and mind of God. And I've given you 3 examples of that. 3 examples of anthropopathism in the Bible. So 1 Samuel 15:11 is when God decides that Saul isn't going to be the king of Israel anymore. It says, I am grieved that I have made Saul king because he has turned away from me and has not carried out my instructions. Now, the reason that this sometimes troubles Christians is because they say something like, well, isn't God omniscient? Didn't God know that Saul was going to turn away from him? And if he knew that he was going to turn away from him, then why is he grieved that Saul did so? Or if he knew that Saul was going to turn away from him, why did he make Saul king of Israel in the first place? So you kind of have this idea of um, of the the idea of God, because he knows all things, he would never feel regret. Um, and yet this passage talks about grieving God, that God is grieved by Saul's rejection. Um, or Exodus 20, very famous passage. I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the fathers to the third and fourth generation for those who hate me. This is one that maybe we really struggle with. In what sense is God jealous? Jealousy is generally thought of as a negative attribute. We don't want to be jealous people, and yet God says that He is a jealous God. Part of that might be a little bit of a changing of the translation, the changing of the way that the word jealous is used in English. Today it has a very negative connotation, and the word in the Hebrew doesn't at all have that negative connotation. And so I might even translate it differently into English today. I might say, I am a zealous God instead of a jealous God. But this idea of ascribing a human emotion to God, even though God isn't literally jealous, but it helps us understand that He will not tolerate, or He will not abide divided loyalties. Either you're wholly devoted to God, or you're not. There's no middle ground. Either you love God with all your heart or soul or strength or mind, or you don't love God. And so that's the sense in which He's a jealous God. He demands our entire worship, our entire selves, our entire heart. Or here's kind of a mix of anthropomorphism and anthropopathism. Then the Lord awoke as from sleep, as a man wakes from the stupor of wine. This, I think, is an especially powerful example, because not only is it the Lord waking, but it's the Lord waking as a man who is waking from being drunk. And of course, so that kind of adds a whole new level of difficulty to the analogy or to the metaphor, because as a man speaks, so it's a simile. It just makes God, it's just a very improper way of thinking about God awaking. First of all, we know that literally God never sleeps. He says that in Psalm 121. But even more strikingly, this idea that God would waking up as if one who is drunk is just offensive. It's just not the way that we normally think about God. And it's important to recognize that that's an anthropopathism, that it's not literally true that God woke up as if He had just woken up from being drunk. It's not literally true. Just as it's not literally true that God was grieved by Saul's abandonment, or it's not literally true that God is a jealous God. It's a way of talking about God, a way of helping us understand what God is like, or how God acts, by ascribing either human forms or human actions or emotions to Him. Anthropomorphism and anthropopathism. So, but the question for this introduction is, why is it so important to remember that these are figures of speech? I've been kind of dancing around this, but we'll just go ahead and come right out and say it now. They're figures of speech in the sense that they're not literally true of God. They're a way of helping us understand what's going on in the heart or mind of God. It's what's going on with the actions of God, based on what God is going to do. It's ascribing human terminology to Him that isn't strictly true in the strict sense of the word. It's not strictly true, because God already knew that Saul was going to turn his back on him, and God already knows that our hearts are going to be turned away or turned toward things that aren't Him. So just over and over again, we have these anthropomorphisms or anthropopathisms, these figures of speech which are not literally true, but help us understand who God is and what he's going to do. Now, why did I spend 15 minutes talking about anthropomorphisms and anthropopathisms? Well, because Genesis chapter 8, verse 1 begins with one of the most famous anthropopathisms in the Bible. Excuse me, my allergies are going crazy today. So, but one of the most famous anthropopathisms in the Bible, but God remembered Noah. And if you forget that this is an anthropopathism, if you think that this is literally true, that God remembered Noah, then that would mean that God had forgotten Noah. And if God had forgotten Noah, then how can God be omniscient? God is an omniscient God. God can't forget about anything or anyone. And so this is why it's so important to remember that anthropomorphisms and anthropopathisms are figures of speech. They're not literally true, but they're just a way of helping us understand what's going on in the heart and mind and actions of God. It's making a metaphor or an analogy, or it could be even a simile, that helps us grasp as finite creatures, helps us grasp what's going on in the heart and mind of God, or the activities of God. And we're going to get a chance to wrestle with, what does it mean when God remembers? That kind of means something specific in the Bible. When God remembers, it means that he's going to turn his attention toward and actually do something about something. So if we just read Genesis 8:1, but God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. And at the bottom of page 1, this verse includes an example of anthropopathism. Noah, or God remembered Noah. So when the Bible says that God remembered Noah, what can't it mean? Well, it can't mean that he had forgotten Noah. It can't mean that God had lost track of Noah or something like that. That God, put Noah on the ark and then got busy with other things, and so and then forgot that Noah was there, and all of a sudden he's like, "Oh, yeah, that's right, Noah is there on the ark. I got to do something about that." That obviously isn't what that means, and so that's why we have to wrestle with this idea of anthropomorphism and anthropopathism, where these human attributes are being ascribed to God in an improper way, and just a way of making it easier for us, or making it possible for us to grasp what's going on in the heart and mind of God. Now, if remembering Noah doesn't mean that he had forgotten Noah, then what does remembering Noah mean? So the top of page 2, I've got 3 other remember passages. 2 of them are positive. One of them is negative. So there's a reminder to us that being remembered by God isn't necessarily a good thing. It depends on whether he's remembering you as his people, or whether he's remembering you as an enemy of his people. So Genesis 30, 22, and 23, remember that Rachel is the second wife of Jacob, and Jacob's first wife, Leah, was able to conceive and have children, but Rachel was not, and this is a great disgrace or a great shame to Rachel. And so she prays to the Lord that she would be able to have children. And it says, then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and she said, God has taken away my disgrace. When it says that God remembered Rachel, it means that he is going to act on Rachel's behalf. He's going to do something for Rachel. And in this sense, what he does is he gives her the ability to conceive. Or Exodus 2, 23 to 25. During that long period, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned in their slavery and cried out, and their cry for help because of their slavery went up to God. God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. Again, this can't mean that God had forgotten about the Israelites. It's not that he had forgotten that they were enslaved in Egypt. But now that now that Exodus is beginning, now that the 400 years of slavery are over, there's going to be this. God is going to spring into action. God is going to do something about the people's misery, and he's going to do that by raising up Moses to be the great deliverer of his Old Testament people from slavery in Egypt. Right? So remember means to think about and to take action on their behalf. Here's the negative one, Revelation 16:19. The great city split into three parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. So Babylon, the city of Babylon, is a common biblical symbol for the enemies of the people of God. So God remembered in the book of Revelation, God remembers Babylon, remembers the great enemy of his people, and pays them back in kind with gives them the cup filled with the wine of the fury of his wrath. So to remember, what it means is that God is going to change courses, or he's going to act on behalf of the one that is remembered. So we go back to our text, Genesis 8, verse 1. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the livestock that were with him on the ark. That means that God is going to step in and act on their behalf. God is going to do something for them. And that thing is described in the second half of the verse. He sent a wind over the earth and the waters receded. So this has been just a long discussion that helps us understand what is meant by God remembered Noah. It's not that God had forgotten Noah. It's not that God had misplaced Noah or something like that. But now God is going to give his attention to do something for Noah, to rescue Noah from his difficult situation, which is being trapped on the ark in the midst of a flood. Okay. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and read Genesis 8, verses 2 to 5. Now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month. On the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. Okay, so first of all, describe the process that God used to end the destruction of the flood. Well, first of all, remember that the flood had been caused originally by God supernaturally causing the waters above and the waters below to cover the earth. So there's a supernatural action of God that causes the flood to begin. But what we notice in the undoing of the flood is that he uses natural means to do so. So he sends a wind over the earth to cause the waters to recede. There's nothing necessarily supernatural about this. It's the sending of a wind that is going to cause the waters to slowly recede, or the earth, just like is happening now here in Wisconsin, with all the snow that is melting. Eventually the ground absorbs all of that water. It just takes time. And that's what's going to happen here for the ark too. It's just going to take time for the earth to handle, to be able to absorb all the water that has been poured out upon it. So the process that God uses to end the destruction of the flood is natural. The beginning of the flood was created by supernatural means. The end of the flood is going to come about by natural means. And then I have the question, at least three ways that God showed his providence for Noah and the ark. Well, the first one is maybe just the most obvious, the one that we just don't want to overlook, but it's easy to overlook because it's so obvious. And that's the idea that Noah and his family are still there. right? So Noah really has saved Noah and his family and the creatures that are on the ark. He's really saved the ark. He's really saved them from the flood. So the fact that they're still on the ark, that they're still safe, that they're still alive, is one act of God's providence. He also is going to use his providence to cause the waters to recede. So he's going to provide, the wind that causes the waters to recede is going to provide the earth's ability to absorb water. That's a part of God's providence, his ability to provide for Noah and the animals that are on the ark by causing the waters to recede on the earth. I think another example of his providence is when he makes the ark come to rest. Can you imagine the relief that would have been for Noah and his family? That for all these days, for these months even, 150 days, the floodwaters covered the earth. For all these months, they've been floating, kind of just wondering what's going to happen. Remember, the ark is just a box. It's not a ship. It's a chest. They weren't able to control where they went. They were totally at the disposal of God. They were totally, up to or left to God's guidance and God's protection. And now suddenly they get to land. They get to a point where they're not moving around anymore. They come to rest on Mount Ararat. And then the water continues to recede, and God's providence is shown in the fact that they're able to see the tops of the mountains. In other words, they're able to see evidence that the waters are receding. Not only have they come to rest on the top of a mountain, but they can look out and see that the waters are receding so that the tops of other mountains can be seen. So you have all these different ways in which the providence of God is on display for Noah and his family, because that the waters are beginning to recede. The damage that has been done by the flood is finally coming to an end. And that's God's providence. That's the way that God works, the way he provides for his people. And I just, don't want to overlook the fact that God continues to provide for his people today, and that he very often usually does so through natural means. We might kind of wish that God would use miraculous means to go about winning our daily providence. If we could just, make a couple $1 million appear in our bank account, that would be great. Or if he could, just kind of make our 401k triple or quadruple in size, that would be great. He could use his miraculous powers to provide for us, but the way that he normally provides for us is through natural means. By giving us the ability to work, by giving us the opportunity to earn money and use that money to provide as a gift from him to provide for our needs. So just like God provided for Noah and his family and the creatures of the ark using natural means, so too he continues to provide for us today using natural means. Okay, so that's verses 2 through 5. Let's go ahead and do 5 through 14, which is the sending of the birds. Okay, this is the birds section of the flood story. So beginning of verse 6, really should say 6. After 40 days, so that's another 40 days on top of the 150 days that they've been waiting, right? 150 days, I got to go back. 150 days that they've covered the ark, that the waters have covered the earth. And that's when on the 7th month, the ark comes to rest in Mount Ararat. On the 10th month, they're able to see the tops of the mountains. So they literally are on the ark for months and months and months. And then after another 40 days, so after 40 days after being able to see the tops of the mountains, after 40 days, Noah opened a window that he had made in the ark. Remember that God had told him to make windows in the ark. So he opened a window that he had made in the ark, and he sent out a raven, and it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. But the dove could find nowhere to perch because there was water over all the surface of the earth. So it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. He waited 7 more days, so another week, and again sent out the dove from the ark. When the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and sent out the dove again, but this time it did not return to him. So he sent out the raven, and the raven doesn't come back. Sends out the dove can't find any place to land, so the dove comes back. Send out the dove again, the dove comes back with an olive branch, an olive leaf in its mouth, and then send out the dove for the 3rd time, and then the dove doesn't come back. That's the birds part of the flood story. So if we're looking at number 4, bottom of the 2nd page of the study guide, number 4, why would a raven be able to survive on the earth before a dove? Because a raven is a carrion animal, right? A raven eats the dead flesh, the dead remains of dead things, and so which there presumably would have been plenty of floating on the surface of the water. Again, this is maybe not the most pleasant of images for us to think about, but that is presumably why the raven doesn't come back right away, is because the raven has a food source, is able to land and recover and eat from the death that the flood has caused. And number 5, imagine what the olive branch or the olive leaf brought back by the dove would have meant to Noah and his family. What does that branch signify? So there are a couple of that branch symbolizes something on a couple of different levels, right? So on one level, on just the physical level, we've got plant life returning to the earth. Remember that at least not all plant life would have been destroyed. Certainly there's plant life in the ocean, for example, that wouldn't have been destroyed. But you would think that the plant life on the earth was destroyed by all of the water, all the time in the water. Most plant life wouldn't have been able to survive that. And yet, whether it was miraculously preserved by God or whether there is new growth that's been caused by God, we're not told in the text. I do seem to remember that earlier this year we had a question asked about this, and I did some research into it. And the overwhelming conclusion of the commentators was that this is new growth. That this is what the dove brings back as a newly grown olive leaf, a post-flood olive leaf. It didn't exist before the flood, but was new growth caused by the flood. So that's on one level, on the level of just that there is life on the earth, that there is plant life on this newly created earth. This recently destroyed and now newly created earth, it does have plant life on it. But then remember also that, and maybe whether the dove is a symbol of peace because of this, or whether this was already a symbol of peace, we're not exactly sure. But the dove and the olive branch are symbols of peace, especially the olive branch. When you extend an olive branch to someone that you are having an argument with, that means that you're trying to restore the relationship. You're trying to restore the peace. And so the fact that the dove brings back an olive leaf or an olive branch is a reminder that there's peace between God and Noah. That the hatred or the enmity that caused the flood has been set aside. That God's wrath has abated. That he is now at peace with his people, or at peace with, now granted there are only 8 of them, but he's at peace with them. He's promised never again to destroy them by means of flood. At least he's going to make that promise here in a second. And then if we look at the top of page 3, I just want to draw some attention to some of the dates that are given in this section. So this is question number 6. Remember that in chapter 6, the flood had begun, I guess I should say chapter 7. The flood had begun when Noah was 600 years, 2 months, and 17 days old. So Noah was 600 years, 2 months, and 17 days old when the flood started. It ended when Noah was 601 years, 2 months, and 27 days old. So it lasted a year and 10 days. The flood lasted over a year. It lasted a year and 10 days. Why is it important that Moses includes such precise chronological data? We've already, we talked about this in last week's lesson a little bit, but just a reminder that this is, that precise chronological data reminds us that the flood was a real thing. It wasn't just a fairy tale. It isn't just a story. It isn't a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, or it isn't once upon a time. That this was a real historical event. And this real historical event took place here on the earth. And so historical is it that it can be measured. That the time that it happened on the earth can actually be measured in years and months and days. It's measured down to the day. So you've got this kind of theological or chronological data here to help remind us of the historicity of the event. But I also think, and we're going to talk about this a little bit in the next section, verses 15 to 19. But it also, I think, brings some perspective to the experience that Noah and his family had. I think when I was growing up, for whatever reason, just because I didn't know the Bible very well, I thought that Noah and his family were on the ark for 40 days and 40 nights, because that's how long the flood lasted, was 40 days and 40 nights. When in reality, the 40 days and 40 nights is just how long the waters were allowed from above and below were allowed to flood the earth. That was the supernatural part. The 40 days and 40 nights are the supernatural part. But then we have the rest of this year and 10 days, which is the natural drying process. The natural means by which God re-prepares the earth for habitation. So I just think it's a reminder to us of the patience of Noah and his family, the length of the ordeal that they went through. This wasn't just a 1 month thing. This, it's difficult as 40 days is the length of Lent. The length of the season of Lent is 40 days. It isn't just that for Noah and his family. It's a year and 10 days that he is on the ark. Really a remarkable truth to remember as we think about Noah and his family, just to think about the patience, the amazing time that Noah spends on the ark. But let's finish our study with one more section. So verses 15 through 19, chapter 8, verses 15 through 19. I guess I stopped at verse 12. I should have kept going. So let's read 13 to 19. By the first day of the first month of Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. So there's where we get the second day, the 27th day of the second month of Noah's 601st year. He had been 600 years, 2 months, 17 days old when it started. Here's where we get 601 years, 2 months, and 27 days old when the earth is completely dry. And then verse 15. Then God said to Noah, come out of the ark, you and your wives, you and your son, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. Bring out every kind of living creature that is with you, the birds, the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, so they can multiply on the earth and be fruitful and increase in number on it. So Noah came out, together with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives, all the animals, and all the creatures that move along the ground, and all the birds, everything that moves on land, came out of the ark, one kind after another. So just a comment, and again, we kind of started this already in the previous section, but to comment on the amazing patience of Noah and his family. To think that they've gotten hints that there is dry ground out there, they've seen the mountaintops, and then they've seen the dove bring back the olive leaf, and the ark has come to a rest, and he takes the cover off the ark. Remember, the ark had a canvas cover that kept the rain from the top deck, and so he takes that cover off the ark, and he can actually see that the earth is dry, and he's been on the ark for a year and 10 days, and he knows then that the earth is completely dry. That's what we're told, is that the earth is completely dry. That's verse 14. But still he and his family have not come off the ark. They probably could have before this. If they had wanted to, they probably could have come off of the ark. They could have, maybe the ground would have been a little wet, but maybe they could have brought their ordeal to an end sooner if they had just gotten off the ark. But notice that they wait until they hear the command of God, until God says, come out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons and their wives. That is when they come out. When they come out when they hear the command of God to come out. They don't come out before that. And I think that's just remarkable patience on behalf of Noah and his family, that they're sitting there on this ark waiting for the command to come. And then finally, after all their patience, after a year and 10 days of waiting, he and all the animals that on the ark are finally invited to come off of the ark. So tremendous patience from Noah and the other creatures that are with him as they await for God's command. Just like God is the one who shuts them in to the ark, so too he is the one that orders them to come out from the ark. Okay? So we're going to stop there. I do want to take just a moment to remind you, or maybe if I didn't do a good job of announcing this, then I'll announce it here for the first time, that our Tuesday morning class will not meet next week on March 10th, because I am taking a class at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School in Deerfield, Illinois. So I will be in a class of my own, and learning in a class next week. So we won't meet next week on the 9th. The next time we'll meet together is March 16th. And better to meet on March 16th than March 15th, which is the Ides of March and the day that Julius Caesar was assassinated. So you always want to beware the Ides of March. So we won't meet on March 15th, but we'll meet again on March 16th. So no class next week on the 9th. The next time that we'll meet is on the 16th, and we'll try to finish up the story of the flood, Genesis 8, beginning at Genesis 8:20, and then going through chapter 9, the covenant to never destroy the earth again by means of a flood. So thank you for your time today. Let's close with the blessing. May the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God the Father, and the fellowship of the Holy Spirit be and abide with us always. Amen. Thank you, and God's richest blessings to you in this week of his grace.